Welcome to the hidden corners where truth and terror collide. Discover a realm where the lines between the living and the supernatural blur as you embark on a journey to the paranormal and visit the mysterious hidden corners of your mind.
Welcome to the Wolfman Chronicles. This is Chapter 5 of Book 7. It makes it Episode 82. And this is The Rescue. Another night, and all four were still alive. That felt like a success. Miguel was breathing with a little less difficulty and was even able to sit up and drink some water mixed with some finely chopped up caribou meat. Jack was digging through the collapsed cockpit, prying the bent metal that was lodged into and around the front of the plane. It had been difficult removing Sam Anderson from the pilot's seat when they had first attempted to move the dead bodies out into the snow, for part of the control panel had pushed up into his chest cavity and blood had frozen over the torn metal area underneath the seat. Before their flight left Anchorage, Sam had explained that all planes flying from October 15th through the 1st of April must carry one pair of snowshoes, one sleeping bag, and one wool blanket for each occupant over 4 years of age. In addition, survival kits are required by Alaska law. That's food, an axe, a first aid kit, a revolver, some ammunition, a small gill net, and an assortment of tackle, a knife, 2 small boxes of matches, and a mosquito head net for each occupant, most of which Rachel had already found and made use of. But what Jack was looking for were the sealed metal containers that carried the other survival necessities that planes were required to carry: colored smoke bombs and flares. Now that the storm had broken and the sun was shining down brightly on the plane wreckage, Jack had a good feeling. Today was the day. The air was crisp, and the snow sparkled like a million tiny diamonds. For the first time in days, the weight of hopelessness had lifted. If the search planes were going to find him, it would be today. He wanted to be ready. So tucked beneath the collapsed control panel, Jack found what he was searching for: a small metal box containing brightly colored smoke bombs and a row of flares. Relief surged through him. Jack wasted no time, carried the box outside along with a box of matches, just in case he had the opportunity to use them. When Sasha woke, there were already 4 messages from Carl. "Meet Grizzly and I at the Search and Rescue Center as soon as you wake up. Urgent." As if there were any other place she'd go, Sasha thought. Still, she rushed to get dressed and took a taxi over to the hangar where the offices were located. Carl and Grizzly had maps spread out on the long table in front of them. 3 other men were gazing down at the maps as well. Carl had a magnifying glass out and was studying the topographic details and looking at photographs of mountain peaks. Sasha walked in the room and immediately noticed the intensified atmosphere in the room. "Well, what's going on? Have you found them?" she asked, taking her coat off and laying it across the chair. "I believe I know where they are," Carl explained. He walked over and gave Sasha a hug and whispered, "The Mavka visited me last night and showed me the plane. I can't explain how it happened, but I saw them. Jack and Miguel and 2 others, a young girl and another man. It was like I was right there in the plane with them." "Are you absolutely certain it wasn't just a dream?" Sasha asked him. "I know. I've asked myself the same thing," Carl replied, "but it's a lead, and we're going to move on it." He brought Sasha over to meet the pilot who would be taking Carl up in his helicopter. "This is Frank Hotchkiss. He's been a friend of mine for years now, and he's a great bush pilot. He knows how to do glacier landings, and he's handled several medevac operations. We're going to have to leave you 2 here, though. We've got to have enough room in Frank's chopper to bring Jack and the others back." "Do you know the exact location?" Sasha asked him. "Well, we're pretty sure we can find the exact spot. There were a couple of distinguishable landmarks, some rock outcroppings, and Sasha, I truly believe the Mavka will be leading us there. Somehow, Carl replied. Sasha wrung her hands and paced back and forth. How soon can you leave? Frank explained that flying conditions were favorable and the wind was coming from the south. However, we can't accurately predict what we'll find once we're up on the glacier. Ice, fog, blowing snow, flat light, whiteout conditions can prove extremely dangerous for a landing. Overflow conditions where water seeps above the ice, but under the snow can cause a plane to become stuck until spring. You see, we won't know exactly what we're facing until we get up and assess the landing possibilities. Sasha nodded. I understand. Easy words to say, but her anxiety wouldn't lessen until Jack was back here, alive and safe. Carl put his hand on Sasha's shoulder. Don't worry. We'll bring him back. Frank walked to the table and started folding up the maps, tucking them into his flight bag. Listen, I've filed the flight plan and we're fueled and warmed up. We can go as soon as they give us a leave. He gave Sasha a reassuring look. We'll do everything we can. The helicopter that Frank flew was a Bell Model 206B Jet Ranger. These were first introduced shortly after 1967 and its popularity grew quickly, particularly due to oil and gas exploration, mining, and forestry in the Northwest Territories, the Yukon, and the Arctic regions, where harsh weather conditions and rough terrain demanded a helicopter that could perform in all environments. The plan was to fly from Fairbanks to a small heliport near Denali National Parks where Temsco operates a private tour business. Now they could fuel the helicopter up there, then cross over into the Denali Borough, a 12,000 square mile wilderness area where glaciers and mountain peaks, rugged wild country, and North America's highest point, Mount McKinley, were. The Jet Ranger lifted off from Fairbanks, its rotor slicing through the crisp winter air. As Frank angled the chopper towards Denali, Carl watched the city shrink beneath him, swallowed by the vast Alaskan wilderness. The morning sun sat low on the horizon, its soft light glinting off endless snowfields and frozen rivers that wound through the landscape like veins of silver. Carl sat in the co-pilot's seat, scanning the terrain below with keen eyes. This place never stops looking like the edge of the world, he muttered. Frank made a few adjustments on the panel and his voice steady as he spoke into his headset. We're making good time. Winds are holding steady out of the south. We should reach Temsco's heliport within about 40 minutes. The helicopter hummed along as it cut through the cold air, the ground below shifting from rolling tundra to rugged foothills. Snow-covered forests stretched endlessly in all directions, the jagged spines of mountains rising in the distance. As they neared Denali National Park, Carl caught his first glimpse of the towering peaks dominating the skyline. The sheer magnitude of the landscape was overwhelming. It was both breathtaking and terrifying. An unforgiving wilderness that had swallowed countless travelers whole. Now, within minutes, Frank eased the chopper down toward a small heliport nestled near the park's entrance. The Temsco facility was quiet, a lone figure emerging from a small operations shack as they landed. Frank and Carl wasted no time. As soon as the rotors came to a stop, they climbed out, refueled the Jet Ranger, and gave the helicopter a good look over. Every second spent here felt like time slipping away. Frank finished his final check and gave Carl a reassuring nod. We're ready. Within moments they were airborne again, the chopper rising swiftly into the sky. This time, they were heading straight into the heart of the Denali wilderness. As they crossed into the Denali Borough, the mountains became even more dramatic. Sharp ridges, frozen cliffs, and deep glacier-carved valleys. Carl looked through high-powered binoculars, scanning for any sign of the downed plane. Frank's voice crackled over the headset. That's McKinley up ahead. The massive peak loomed in the distance, wreathed in wisps of ice cloud, and somewhere beyond it, Jack and the others were waiting. Carl sat in silence, watching the jagged peaks of the Alaska range pass beneath them, and listening to the helicopter's rotor blades thumping rhythmically. "We've been friends a long time," Frank said, breaking the silence, "and there's a lot of land out here. When you asked me to fly you out here today, I had to question your hold on reality, Carl. I hope you're not just leading me on a wild goose chase. You're spending a hell of a lot of money on a whim. I'd like to know why you think you're so sure of this location." Carl glanced over. "Now that's a hard story to tell, Frank." "I'm all ears," Frank replied. Carl let out a big sigh. Frank's skepticism was understandable. Sure, he could tell him the truth and risk sounding like a lunatic. "I don't blame you for doubting me," Carl said, finally adjusting the strap on his headset. "If I was in your position, I'd be thinking the same thing. But I know where that plane is because—" He hesitated, then clenched his jaw. "Because something showed me." Frank shot him a sideways glance. "Something?" Carl exhaled. "Frank, have you ever heard of a mavka?" Now, Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he let out a slow breath and scanned his gauges, and finally he spoke. "Carl, you know how insane that sounds, right?" Carl's eyes never left the horizon. I do. But you gotta believe me, Frank. I wouldn't lead you out here and risk both of our lives if I wasn't absolutely certain of it." Frank looked out the side window as if he was trying to kill some time while he decided what to say. "Have you been drinking too much of Grizzly's home brew?" he asked gently. Carl laughed. "Not this time." "Well," Frank exhaled, glancing at the topo map on the panel. "Well, we'll know soon enough if your ghost led us right." He adjusted their speed slightly. "Because according to your coordinates, we should be just about on top of that wreckage any minute now." Carl nodded, staring hard at the vast white expanse below them. The mavka had shown him the way. He just prayed it hadn't all been a dream. Miguel was sitting up again, wincing in pain as he tried to stand. "Hold on," Rachel said, climbing over the blankets to give Miguel a hand. "It looks like you're getting your strength back," she said. "Thank you for doing this," he said, his hands on his chest. "Doing what?" Rachel asked. "The bandage. It's really helping," Miguel replied. "What bandage?" Miguel unzipped his jacket and unbuttoned his shirt. His ribs were tightly wrapped with a gauze bandage, expertly tied. "What the heck? I didn't do that," Rachel commented, noticing that the bandage was wrapped completely around his midsection. His shirt and his jacket would have had to have been removed. "Could Jack have done that?" she asked, but then added, "But I don't see how he could have. I've been in here with you the entire time." Miguel felt the soft gauze, the light fabric that was nearly iridescent, shimmering like an opal. He smiled. It hadn't been a dream. The mavka had been here. And at that moment he knew with all certainty that they were going to be rescued. And moments later he heard Jack yelling, "Rachel, Jonas, get out here." The Jet Ranger bucked slightly as a gust of wind rolled off the mountainside, jostling the cockpit. Frank adjusted the cyclics, steadying their descent as the frozen wilderness stretched endlessly beneath them. Ice-crusted peaks loomed in the west, their jagged spines clawing at the pale blue sky. Carl squinted at the landscape below. From this altitude, the world was nothing but an endless sea of white, with glaciers flowing like frozen rivers, and snowdrifts shifting in the wind, the ice, and the rock blending into an almost featureless expanse. Frank scanned the terrain, his voice was tight. "Damn it, Carl. This whole place is a graveyard. I don't see a damn thing." Carl leaned forward, his gut was twisting. The mavka had shown him this place. He knew it was here. The rock formations, the glacial flow, the crevasse. It was exactly as he saw it in his dream. By knowing he was in the right location didn't make the plane any easier to spot. The wreckage wasn't sprawled out in the open like a beacon. It was tucked into the mountainside, half buried in wind-blown snow, hidden among rock outcroppings that cast long, deceptive shadows across the landscape. The ridge line, Carl murmured. The plane went down lower than the search teams thought. Look at the elevation. We're a couple of 1,000 feet above tree line, but still not as high as the original estimates. Frank gritted his teeth. We're looking for a needle in an ice field. Carl was about to answer when something caught Frank's eye. There, Frank barked, pointing. A glint, just a flicker of something reflecting the sunlight, flashed near a jagged ridge below. It was barely visible, like a pinprick of light against an ocean of white. Carl's stomach clenched. That's got to be them. Frank pulled the chopper into a controlled bank, swinging around for a better look. And as they closed in, the wreckage came into view. A mangled stretch of fuselage, buried partially in a deep snowbank. Now the tail was gone, the wings twisted and torn, and jagged metal protruded like broken bones. The entire scene was disturbingly still. Then, movement. A streak of red shot skyward, and then another. Flares! Carl shouted. Frank's pulse hammered. They're alive! Jack stood near the wreckage, bundled against the cold, his arm raised as he fired off another flare. The red smoke curled against the sky, a desperate signal against the vast emptiness. Carl slammed his fist against the console. We've got them! Frank's hands were steady as he adjusted their approach. Now let's find a place to land before this wind decides to throw us into a mountain. The rescue was just beginning. Frank scanned the landscape below. Jaw was clenched. The wreckage was wedged into a steep, snow-covered slope, with jagged rocks outcropping on either side. There was no easy landing zone, not without serious risk. Carl gripped the side of his seat. God, we can't put her down here. Frank's eyes darted over the terrain. No, but there's a small plateau about 100 yards downslope. It's tight, but I can make it work. Carl followed his gaze and spotted the relatively flat section of snow-covered ice. It wasn't ideal, but it was their best shot. Frank took the bullhorn and hollered, Jack, if you can hear me, we're coming in. We'll set down just below you. Can you make it down to us? Standing outside the wreckage, Jack raised and swung his arms in a cross pattern, indicating that he had heard him. Oh, we'll make it. He motioned to Miguel, Rachel, and Jonas, who were already bundling up. We're going to have to move fast before the wind shifts again. Outside, the sound of the helicopter grew louder, reverberating through the mountains like a heartbeat. Frank skillfully brought the chopper in low, carefully maneuvering as snow kicked up thick, blinding swirls. He hovered for a moment, the skids just inches above the surface, then gently eased down onto the plateau. Carl let out a shaky breath. That was some damn fine flying. Frank barely acknowledged the praise. They need to move, now. Up at the wreckage, Jack helped Jonas forward while Miguel gripped Rachel's arm, guiding each other down the treacherous slope. The snow was uneven, some areas packed solid while others gave way beneath their weight. Halfway down, Jonas stumbled. Carl was already out of the chopper, trudging up to meet him. He reached Jonas first, looping the young man's arms over his shoulders. You're almost there, Carl grunted. Just keep moving. Jack and Miguel reached the helicopter next, helping Rachel inside. Carl brought Jonas in last, practically hauling him into the cabin. Frank didn't wait. The second the last door was shut, he pulled the collective, lifting the Jet Ranger into the air. The wind battered them immediately, trying to shove them into the mountainside. Frank fought the controls, hands steady, jaw locked. Miguel collapsed into his seat, his breath coming in short gasps. He felt the warmth of the helicopter's cabin wrap around him like a lifeline. Carl clapped a hand on Jack's shoulder. Boy, you're a sight for sore eyes. And Jack exhaled. Took you long enough. Frank let out a short laugh, still focused on flying. Next time, don't crash in the worst damn place possible. Jack leaned his head back against the seat, exhaustion and relief washing over him in equal measure. Frank keyed the radio, his voice steady but urgent. Fairbanks Command, this is Frank Hotchkiss, Denali rotor, 45 miles north of the summit at 12,000. We have 4 survivors aboard, all accounted for. Repeat, all 4 are alive. We're en route, planning to refuel at Temsco before heading out. Get word to Sasha. Jack is with us. Static crackled, then a response. Copy that, Denali rotor. Stand by for further instructions. Great work out there. Frank barely heard the reply. His focus was on flying. The wind had picked up again, gusting down from the higher elevations. The helicopter fought hard against it, the rotor straining as he maneuvered carefully between the ridges. He looked at the fuel gauge. We'll have enough to make Temsco, but we don't want to push it. Carrying this much weight, I'm not taking any chances. Weather can turn on us in a heartbeat. Meanwhile, in the back, Jack sat with his head tilted against the seat, exhausted but alert. He could feel the warmth creeping back into his frozen limbs, but his mind was still sharp. Rachel shifted beside him, her voice hoarse. How long until we're back? Couple hours, Frank called back. But first, we refuel. Miguel exhaled, rubbing his hands together. I can wait a couple more hours. Jack glanced over at Jonas, who had his eyes closed but was still shivering. They had survived the crash, survived the cold, and now, finally, they were getting out. But Jack knew better than to relax just yet. The Alaskan wilderness wasn't done with them until their feet were on solid ground. As the helicopter pushed forward, the vast snow-covered expanses stretched below them. The ridges and the valleys that had hidden them for so long were now falling away behind them. They were going home. Rachel sat hunched in her seat, her arms wrapped tightly about herself. At first, Jack thought she was just shaken from the cold. But then he saw the way her shoulders trembled, the way she turned her face toward the window, trying to hide her tears. Without a word, he reached over and draped an arm around her shoulders. She stiffened slightly. Then, as if the weight of everything finally collapsed on her, she let out a choked sob and buried her head in his chest. I'm sorry, she whispered, wiping her face. Her breath hitched and she shook her head. Jack didn't pull away. You don't have to apologize. Rachel exhaled sharply, trying to keep herself together. It's just, we're going home, but I don't even have a home to go to. She swallowed hard. My parents, they were on the plane. They're gone. Jack's chest tightened. He had known, of course. The bodies they'd been forced to leave behind in the frozen wilderness. He knew her parents were among them. But hearing Rachel say it made it feel even heavier. Jonas, sitting across from them, kept his head down. He had a family waiting for him, people who could wrap their arms around him and welcome him home. But Rachel, she had no one. Jack squeezed her shoulder. Do you have any other family we could call? Rachel sniffled, hesitating. I have an aunt. Somewhere in Nevada, I think, but my mom and her haven't spoken in years. I don't even know if she'd remember me. Jack didn't hesitate. Then you're coming with us. You can stay with Sasha and me until we figure something out. Rachel turned to him, her red-rimmed eyes searching his face. Oh, I don't want to be a burden. Jack smiled. You won't be, he said firmly. I know what it's like to have nowhere to go, and I know what it's like when someone offers you a place to land. He gave her shoulder a light squeeze. You're not alone, Rachel. Not anymore. Rachel let out a shaky breath, fresh tears slipping down her face, but this time they weren't just from grief. There was relief in them, too. The lights of Fairbanks glowed like a beacon in the distance, cutting through the darkness of the Alaskan wilderness. Frank guided the helicopter in, his movements precise despite the exhaustion settling into his bones. The familiar sight of the airfield grew larger with every passing second, and as he made his approach, he spotted figures gathered near the landing zone. Sasha, Grizzly, and Jonah's parents. They were standing just beyond the landing pod, arms wrapped around each other against the cold. Carl had radioed ahead. Sasha knew Jack was coming home, but she wouldn't believe it till she saw him with her own eyes. Frank brought the chopper down smoothly, the skids touching the frozen ground with a soft thud. The rotor slowed, and before the blades had fully stopped, the door swung open. Jack stepped out, his boots crunching against the snow-covered tarmac. Sasha broke into a sprint. She didn't care about the cold. She didn't care about the people around her. She didn't care about anything except the fact that Jack was there, standing, breathing, and alive. Jack barely had time to brace himself before she crashed into him, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist. He staggered back a step but held her just as fiercely, burying his face into her hair. Sasha's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. "I thought I lost you." Jack's voice was hoarse. "I'm here." He pulled back just enough to look at her, brushing a few strands of hair from her face. "I'm here, Sasha." Without another word, she pulled him back into another hug, holding on as if she'd never let him go. Around them, the others stepped out of the helicopter. Carl gave a satisfied nod, clapping Frank on the shoulder. Jonas was met by a small cluster of people who wrapped him in their arms. Rachel stood off to the side, uncertain, watching it all unfold. Jack turned and caught her eye, giving her a small, reassuring nod. She was part of this now. Sasha finally pulled away just enough to look up at him again. "Let's go home," she whispered. Jack exhaled, the weight of the past days finally lifting from his shoulders. "Yeah," he said, his arm still around her. "Come on, Rachel. Let's go home."
Thank you for listening to this week's episode, and I hope you'll join us next week for another installment of the Wolfman Chronicles. And until then, have a great week, everyone.
Hey folks, Clay Steele here. You know, I spend a lot of time outdoors around this here campfire. If you're like me, you get downright annoyed by all those pesky mosquitoes buzzing around. They're just looking for a free meal. Nothing ruins a good night under the stars faster than slapping and scratching at bites. And that's why I keep the bee-itch Stop. I keep it handy. One swipe and that itch is gone. No more burning, no more scratching, just good old relief. Made right here in Nevada with all natural ingredients. It's safe for the whole family. So if you're tired of being a mosquito buffet, do yourself a favor and get you some bee-itch Stop today. And this is Clay Steele. Watch out for them bugs.